When you hear transformation in Blender, what this usually means is either rotating, scaling, or moving an object to a different location. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that transformation we did to this cube. And the first thing you need to understand about using any hotkey in Blender is that the instant you press that hotkey to use that tool, you are immediately engaged in using that tool. So for instance, when we pressed R to rotate, the second we press it, you can see these little dotted lines going from the origin of this cube, and the origin point of an object is a little orange dot in the middle of it. You see this dotted line going from the origin stretched out to these two little black arrows where the mouse cursor is. So the instant we pressed that R key to rotate, we are immediately engaged in rotating this object. Whereas in a lot of other programs, what would happen if you wanted to say rotate something would be you would select the object, then press R to rotate, but the rotation wouldn't begin until after you pressed R and then you clicked down and then held your mouse down and did your rotation, then let go. However, Blender was built for speed, so the instant you press that hotkey to use that tool, you are engaged in using it. You do not need to click your mouse down. So right now I'm not holding any mouse button down, I'm just simply hovering my mouse around. And when I've decided I'm finished with the change I want to make, I click and then that rotation is done. However, if you start using a tool such as rotate, and you decide, oh wait, you know what, I decided I actually don't want to do this, you can instantly cancel the use of that tool by right-clicking instead of left-clicking, and this will snap your object back to however it was from before you started to change it. Okay, so I'm going to press Ctrl Z a few times to get this cube back to its original state again. So once again, that's R to rotate. And when we're done, we can click on the screen somewhere, S to scale. And if we want to cancel what we're doing, we can just right click and that will get us back to where we were. But if I wanted to scale this up big, I could do this and then left click. And then we can press G to move our object. But it's a lot easier to think of G as the grab button because grab starts with G. So we can press G to grab and pick up our object and move it wherever. So there's another real important aspect to transforming objects in Blender, and that is the idea of constraining your transformations. In other words, forcing the transformation you're doing, either the rotation, the scaling, or the moving, forcing it to transform along a specific axis, such as X, Y, and Z here. Once again, I'm going to press Ctrl Z a few times to get our cube back to its default state. And just like there are multiple ways of transforming your object, there are also multiple ways of constraining your transformations. So for instance, right now if I press S to scale, I can scale this whole object up, this whole cube, make it larger or smaller. But if I wanted to constrain this to the Z-axis, which is up and down in 3D space, I could press the letter Z on my keyboard after pressing S to scale, and now it's only scaling up and down along that Z-axis. So I could click to confirm that there. If you're ever confused about which axis you're looking at, you can always come down to the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, and here you'll notice this little XYZ widget, which will always let you know the basic direction of one of these center grid lines. So for instance, you can see where it says X here, next to this little line here, and you can see that this center grid line is similar to the line that is pointing to X, and this line going up this way is similar to the line that's pointing to Y. Now there is no line for Z which is up and down because it's pretty hard to confuse where the Z axis is. It's just literally representing, going straight up or down. So it's not really represented on the grid. Now you may notice sometimes when you are rotating your view that the line on the widget telling us which direction is X or which direction is Y is slightly skewed from the main grid line, But what this actually is a slight distortion that comes from the type of lens you are viewing the main 3D view through. So if you press T to bring up your tool shelf and property shelf, on the property shelf, not to be confused with the properties panel over here, which has all these little tabs. I know that's a little confusing, but the property shelf is what gets dismissed or brought up when you press T over here on the right side. But under here where it says view, notice that there's this option which says lens. And this just controls your regular workspace view here. So if I wanted to change this to say a 20mm lens, I could click that. And now we're sort of viewing the world through that way. Or if I wanted to change this to 55, we've got a much more foreshortened view. But anyway, if I distort this to something crazy, you can see how crazy these lines get. So even though optically these may look slightly off, you can for the most part pretty easily tell that this center grid line here is going in the same direction as this one, which is, so that makes this X, and this center grid line here is going in the same direction that's pointing to Y, which makes that Y. And no matter how you turn this around, you can still basically make that out. Now, it gets harder if you're, looking at this through a crazy lens like that. So I return it to 35, which is what we keep it at by default. And if I close that up, you can easily see that this direction is pointing to Y, so this is Y. So if I were to press S to scale, and I wanted to constrain this to the Y axis, I would press Y, and I would automatically know which direction it was going to scale when I pressed Y, because I know that this line here is similar to the center grid line here. Likewise, if I wanted this to go in the X direction and I press S to scale and then X to constrain it to the X axis, I know it's going to go the direction that that X axis is pointing there. Now, when you first installed Blender, or if you're a longtime Blender user, you may notice that the axes on this widget and the center grid lines in Blender default are set to different colors. And the point of that is to try to make it easier, I guess, to keep track of which axis is which. However, it sort of defeats the point of having a widget at all, because if you've got that widget and you, for some reason, have to know which axis things are pointing towards, you can always just check out that widget and know right away. To me, having a bunch of different colors and extra lines and things on the screen just adds to visual noise and distracts you from the actual object or scene you're trying to work on, which is why all of these lines are kept monotone in Sensei format. However, if you really prefer them to be colored the way they are or just some other color, you can click under Display here and then click Customize Theme. And down here where it says Grid and XYZ, you could change these grid lines to whatever you want, and notice both the grid line color changes as well as the part of the widget. And if you wanted to keep those changes, you could press Save Changes there. And if later you decide, you know what, that is kind of pointless, I don't need a bunch of bright colors distracting me from what I'm working on, when I already know that if this thing is pointing this way, then that means X, and that thing's pointing that way, then that means Y, and Z is up and down, you can come back here and press Reset. So I'll close that up and close Display as well. Me personally, I really like to usually work in full screen mode unless I'm having to do something with the camera or properties panel or something. And you can make any panel in Blender full screen by pressing the tilde key. That's the little squiggly key under your escape key on your keyboard. So if you hover your mouse over any one of these areas, you can make it full screen by tapping this key. But the way I usually like to make my main 3D view workspace big is by pressing this full screen button here. It's a really convenient way to remove all the distractions from this single thing you're working on when you don't need to be messing with animation or the camera or properties or something else. So I'm going to go ahead and press that full screen button there. Okay, so before we transform or constrain, transform, anything else, let's add some more objects to this scene for a little variety. So I'm going to press 1 to go into front view. Notice that whenever you are in an orthographic view, such as 1 for front, 2 for back, 3 for left, 4 for right, 5 for top, or 6 for bottom, wherever you drag your 3D cursor, that's this little lifesaver looking dealy, by right clicking, whenever you let go in one of these modes, the 3D cursor will automatically snap to a point on the grid. Also, if you use your scroll wheel to zoom in, you'll notice that this grid constantly subdivides as you zoom in or zoom out. We can bring up our add menu to add objects to our scene in two different ways. We can either double right click, which will move our 3D cursor and bring up the add menu, sort of a quick way of adding an object to wherever you click. And I could add, say, a cone, or you can drag your 3D cursor by holding the right mouse button, then letting it go somewhere, and add an object the traditional way by pressing Shift A to bring up the add menu. And we could say add a torus shape here. I'm just going to double right click and add a few more random shapes so we've got different kind of stuff to do stuff to here. Okay. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different objects. So let's try transforming them. So let's click on the cone. And of course we can press R to rotate. And if we want to constrain this rotation, we can use the same techniques we used to scale that cube. We could press Y to constrain our transformation to the Y-axis, or X to constrain it to the X-axis, or Z to constrain it to the Z-axis. So I could click the Suzanne head and press R to rotate, and then constrain that rotation to the X-axis there. And I could select this torus here. And if I wanted to rotate it along this Y-axis, I could just press R and then Y and rotate it that way. We can also do the same thing when we're moving things or when we're pressing G to grab. So I could press G to grab to move this sphere, but then I could press Y, and this would constrain the movement to the Y-axis, or I could press X, that would constrain it to the X-axis, or Z, which would constrain it to the Z-axis. Once again, if I start to perform a transformation, say I press G to grab and Z to constrain it to the Z-axis, but then all of a sudden I realize, you know what, I don't really want to move that, we can right-click to cancel whatever we were doing. So pressing X, Y, or Z after you have pressed R to rotate, S to scale, or G to grab is one way that you can constrain your transformations, but a much more intuitive way, and the way I usually prefer to constrain my transformations, is by tapping and holding the middle mouse button down after you have begun a transformation. So say for instance, I click on this cube and I want to move this cube somewhere. Say I want to move it up there. Now I could press G to grab it, and then I could consult this little widget and see, okay, this line here is going that way. That means that's the Y-axis. So I'll tap Y, and then this will let me move this along the Y-axis. I could do that. But my favorite way to constrain transformations is just to tap and hold the middle mouse button, and then you can just gesture your mouse towards whatever direction you want, and it will just go in the direction that you want. And this way, there's no worry about what axis you're on or figuring out the details of it. You just basically tell the computer to put it where you want it. So when I press G to grab, I can hold middle mouse down to constrain, and then now wherever I aim this object, it will be automatically stuck to whatever axis I sort of tell it to go. So this is my favorite way of constraining things, and it works with moving things. Or if I was going to rotate this, I could press R to rotate, hold down middle mouse to constrain, and then just click and hold down the middle mouse button until I see that the object is spinning or rotating in the direction I want. As soon as I see it's going in the direction I want, I can let go of the middle mouse button, and then it will be locked to transforming in that direction. But if I all of a sudden change my mind, say, you know what, I don't want this spinning around the Z-axis, I want it spinning around this one here, which is the Y-axis. When I consult my little widget, what I can do is hold down the middle mouse button again and move it around until it is doing what I want. Then I let go. You can actually see some of those lines disappear, and now you're definitely locked in rotating the direction you want this to go, and you just rotate it till you're happy and click to confirm. So same with scaling, so I could press S to scale. And if I wanted to scale it out long ways, I could hold middle mouse down and drag this out like this. Or if I wanted to scale it up and down on the Z-axis, I could hold my middle mouse button down and gesture up, and that happens. Now, usually this works really well. Occasionally you can be looking at something in like a weird angle or something, and you'll try to constrain a transformation by holding the middle mouse button down, but you might find it really difficult to get it to actually spin or scale or move in the constraint axis you want to. So then at that point, you might have to resort to pressing X, Y, or Z, but most of the time you don't have to. You can just press down the middle mouse button until Blender figures out where you're trying to get it to do, and then you let go once it's locked and you're good to go. Another interesting way of controlling your transformations is just by actually putting Blender into different views. So for instance, if I were to press 1 to go into front view and then select this cone right here, if I were to press R to rotate this cone, it's automatically going to be restricted to rotating towards whatever axis the view is facing towards. So in front view, it's going to be restricted to rotating like that, and I could right click to cancel that. Or if I were to press 5 to go into top view and press R to rotate it, notice it's constricted to rotating that way as well. Or if I were to click this Suzanne monkey head and press R to rotate it, notice it's also constricted that way. So that's another quick visual way to get something to rotate in the way you want it to if you're having trouble. Okay, so I've showed you about transformations, that is rotating, scaling, and moving objects. Then I've showed you how to constrain those transformations, either by tapping one of these axis directions or just by the much better way, holding middle mouse button to gesture towards the way you want it to go, so you can, like a child, just say, go that way, and it does what you want it to do, which is my favorite way. But there's a third level of control that we can gain through hotkeys when transforming things, and that is by actually holding the control key. So if I were to click this cone here and say I wanted to rotate it only a quarter circle exactly, for starters I could press R to rotate, and then I could hold down my middle mouse button until I saw that it was rotating around the axis I want, which is that one. And finally, the third level of control here is by literally holding control on the keyboard, and this will cause this to snap in increments, and this lets me get a precise rotation like this. So if I were to press 1 to go into front view, which, whoops, looks like I didn't actually do because I was looking at it at the wrong angle. So press Control Z to do that. But if in front view, I press R to rotate, and I'm already constrained along this axis, so if I hold Control, I can get this to rotate more precisely. Or if, let's say I would press 5 to go into top view, I can press R to rotate it like this, hold Control, and as you can see there, I can get super snapped rotations as well. Same thing for scaling. I could press S to scale this, middle mouse to constrain, and then I could hold Control to get it to snap in increments. So if you prefer not to hold Control, you can actually click this Snap During Transform button here, which is located here on the Builder menu, as well as down here on the 3D View header menu. And that's the same thing as holding Control while you do a transformation, such as scale, or rotate, or move, or G to grab. See how it's snapping like that? So Control is just a fast way to get it to do that if you don't want to leave that on all the time. So down here on the 3D View header menu, we've got over where you see this sort of little multicolored peace sign thing, which is actually an icon of what this widget looks like in Blender default. This is the 3D manipulator widget. If we click and turn this on, this will add a visual widget to whatever object we have selected, which allows us to transform in the 3 different ways that we've talked about. So right now, only 2 of the 3 ways are activated. So we've got location, that's where we press G to grab and move stuff to different locations. That's pushed down. And then we have the rotation option represented by a little curved arc there. However, the third way that we transform things, which is by scaling, is not pressed in, so we don't see an option for that on this widget. But if we were to hold Shift and click this, we would then see these little cube icons pop up on our 3D manipulator widget, and that means if we press those, they will be scaled in whatever direction that we press them. So by default, only the location part of the widget is available. So if you just want one of these items available, you can just click on it. Or if you want multiple, you can hold Shift and add those until you customize your widget however you want. So if we click on the little arrowhead of this widget, this will move our object in the direction of the little arrowhead. Or if we click one of the round parts of the widget, this will rotate the object in that direction. And of course, if we click on one of the little cube things, which represent the scale part of the transform, it will scale the object. Now, if we take a look at this widget, it really starts from here and then ends where this button is that says global. And this is really all a part of this widget's control options. So if we click where it says global, notice there are several different options available here. Honestly, I only ever use two options with this, which are global and normal. So when this widget is set to global, it's basically going to allow you to transform things along these XYZ axis here. So when I press up like that, you definitely can understand whenever you press it which way things are going to go. And like I said, the only other option I use here is normal. A normal is basically telling us what direction is a polygon facing. So for instance, with this torus shape right here, which is made of a bunch of different four-sided polygons here, if we press tab to go into edit mode, we can actually get some information of exactly how many faces, polygon faces, this object is composed of, and it turns out to be 576. When we get out of edit mode and head back to object mode, we get information about the entire scene. But if you want to know exactly what's going on with one particular object, you can press tab and learn about it. While we are in edit mode, we have this option in our properties shelf over here, once again that shows up when we press T, called mesh display. And this item goes away when you're in object mode, so watch, it will disappear when I press tab to go back into object mode here. But in edit mode, we have this available, and down here, there's an option that says normals. So if I click this face button right here, you'll see these little blue lines pop up all around the polygons of this object. I can actually use this size slider to increase the size of these little lines. And all these little lines are telling us is what direction are these faces pointed, which in a lot of situations, this may seem, pretty obvious. So it's like, yeah, I get that that's sort of facing that way. I don't really need this thing to tell me which way they're facing, but in some situations it can help. So basically that's all a normal is. It's information about what direction is that polygon facing. So I'll go ahead and shut that off and press tab to go back into object mode. And the need to change this to normal sometimes can be explained pretty well with this cube that we've transformed a bunch over here. Right now, imagine that I wanted to scale this cube out towards the direction that it was facing. So I wanted this face to go out that way and that face to go out that way. Currently with this on global, if I try to do that, there's no option to get it to scale in the direction that we want. But if we change this to normal, which as we just explained with the torus over here, the widget will now transform, that is, rotate, move, or scale along the directions of the object's normals. So if we press tab to go into edit mode, under mesh display, turn on the normal view for this thing, this is the direction it's going to scale. That's much more like we want. So when we press tab to go back into object mode and we click on this thing to scale, notice it's scaling how we want. So if most of that went over your head, just remember that at some point in the future, if you're desperately trying to get something to scale, but it's like it's just not bending in the way you want it to, try switching this from global to normal, and you may find some success with being able to transform, that is, rotate, move, or scale your object in the direction that you're desperately trying to get it to go, but it just won't seem to go. So that's what switching this to normal is good for. So the final method of transforming we can do is with menus. If you'll notice here over on the property shelf, while in object mode, we have this transform menu. And if we click this open, we'll have a lot of direct values we can use. So rather than using a widget to transform something or a hotkey to transform something, we can enter these values in directly with the transform menu. However, available in Sensei format is a menu that is similar to this transform menu, but has a few more options and I think cleans it up just a little bit. So I usually prefer to, instead of use that, to click open this dimensions box. And to get a better idea of this, what I'm going to go ahead and do is click this to turn off our widget, press A to select everything, X to delete, and I'm going to press Shift C, which recenters my 3D cursor to the center of the grid, press Shift A, and add a cube. So here we can see that under the scale, this cube is 2 by 2 by 2. And as far as location, it's exactly at 0, 0, and rotation is all set to 0 as well. If I want to transform this object, I can do it directly with values. So I can either say click this X value here and manually drag it. Or if I knew I wanted it to be exactly however many units over, I could click here and let's say press 5. And that would put that 5 units over. Now notice here under units that we're now set to none. So these values are Blender's internal units, but they don't really mean anything. If you want to, you can switch this to either the metric or imperial system. So if I were to switch imperial, now we're dealing with like feet and inches and stuff like that. And if I wanted to reset this, the location of this cube, I could come over here and press reset all. And that would reset all of the transformations, that is location, rotation, and scale that we've done to the cube thus far. And down here, this actually lets me control the actual units of the grid. So right now it's set up to be 1 foot by 1 foot. That's one grid unit. But I could say make it to 5. And so say I wanted this cube to be exactly 5 feet over. I could come over here to where it says X, enter 5, and so now it's gone 5 feet over, which is what we've set the grid up to be exactly. That's why it went over 1 unit. So we can enter manual rotation values here. So I could put like 90 on the Y, which you can't really tell the difference because it's a cube. Okay, let's not use a cube. Let's add something like this monkey head so we can actually tell when it's rotating. Okay, so for instance, if I were to enter 90 here, we can see that rotated this exactly 90 degrees, or say I wanted 180 on the Z value. Now we've done that, or we could play with these sliders and what have you. Notice that under the scale part of the dimension, we have a little bit more room to work with X, Y, and Z values, because this obviously the scale of something can be like a huge number, whereas rotation and location aren't usually that large to deal with. If ever you're having trouble seeing this, you can always drag this menu out and see this more clearly if you want. But in the same way that we learned to constrain our transformations by, say, if we wanted to rotate this thing and constrain it to the X-axis, we tap X. Or we just press R to rotate and then middle mouse to constrain and move it towards the direction we want it to go. Once we see it's doing that, we let go of the middle mouse and now it's constrained there. In the same way we can constrain those, we can actually lock these transform values so that whenever you go to transform the object, it's only possible for the object to move in the direction you want it to. So for instance, I could press X to delete this monkey head. I'll press Shift A. And under mesh, add a cube, S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, S to scale, middle mouse to constrain again, S to scale, middle mouse to constrain again, and bring that in. So say I had something like this, and I knew that I only ever wanted this thing to rotate around this way, like this. So I guess that's around the Z axis there. What I could do is under rotation, lock everything but the Z-axis. So this is another way of constraining transformations. If I lock the X and lock the Y, now when I press R to rotate, I don't have to manually press Z or constrain anything, because it's only possible, no matter what happens, for this thing to rotate in one of those axes that aren't locked. So the only one that's not locked is Z. So now whenever I press R to rotate, it's only ever going to rotate like that. Same thing with any of these other transform types. So if I were to say lock the Z and the Y axis and I press G to grab, this thing is only ever going to move down that X axis no matter what I do. So I don't have to manually press X after I press G to move it, or try to use my middle mouse to constrain, because when I press G to grab, as you can see that little value going up in none of the others, it's only ever going to move like that. So same deal with scale. So say I locked Z and locked X and I press S to scale, now it's only ever going to scale along the Y axis.